Motorsport alignments are a very popular upgrade for most Porsches heading out on track. But how much difference do they actually make? In this video, we're going to find out. We're here today on an RMA track day at Anglesey Circuit in Wales. We're here with our Cayman GT4. And what we're doing in this series, for those of you new to the channel, we are taking our car from a completely standard road car all the way to a purpose-built track car. However, we're not going to fit all the parts all at once. We're fitting them one by one, and we're data logging the difference that every single upgrade makes, so you can see exactly what difference that makes to the car. In our last video, we rigged up the car with the VBOX Motorsport HD2 package, but we also fitted the infrared tyre temperature sensors. So these are the sensors that have 16 channel input, and they're measuring across the width of the tyre in real time alongside the video footage and all the G data, so we can see exactly what the tyre is doing temperature wise as it goes around the circuit. So now we've got all the data logging equipment installed on the car and calibrated, we can finally get going with our first upgrade for the chassis. Now, the most common starting point for most people, especially with a Porsche GT car, is getting the standard suspension set up properly. This is really important for heading out on track, and hopefully we're going to see exactly why today. So the Porsche GT chassis is standard, is extremely adjustable. We can adjust ride heights, anti-roll bar settings, camber and tow on the front and the rear axles. That's a lot of adjustment for a standard car. This means that in one sitting and one setup, we can apply a lot of changes to this car to really change its behaviour. So the car as it sits right now is in its completely standard form. So it's going to head out on track right now, and we're going to see what issues are presented by the completely stock setup out on track. With these new sensors mounted on there from VBOX with the tyre temperature displayed, we thought it would be absolutely best to get a professional racing driver behind the wheel of our Porsche Cayman GT4. So we've chosen Chris Dymond, who is a professional racing driver and driver coach with a lot of experience in Porsche chassis. So his driving is going to be extremely consistent between setup changes. So that means the data difference we see on the tyre temperatures is going to be due to the setup changes or component changes, and not just because of a completely different driving style lap to lap. Straight away, we can see from the display in the top left-hand corner, showing the tyres, we've got front left, front right, rear left, rear right. This is measuring the tyre temps on our brand new Michelin Cup 2 tyres. We fitted those fresh for today, so we've got completely fresh rubber, completely new grip, so we can see exactly how that tyre behaves around the lap. And straight away on this outlap with a completely standard OEM suspension setup, we can see the outside edges of the front tyres getting absolutely hammered through the corners. They're taking such a large amount of heat through the compound, and that's leading to understeer as Chris is taking the car around the circuit. A lot of temperature is being carried through the compound, and it's also staying in the tyre. Even down this really long straight section, you'd expect the tyre, like the front right did, to come back to normalization, but because of the understeer and the heat scrubbed into the compound, the tyre temperature stayed up for the entire length of that straight line, meaning that as we come back into the apex, it's staying extremely hot on the outside edge, and that's going to lead to much more tyre wear, a lot of tyre shredding, and it's also going to give that understeer on the front axle. You can see there Chris turning in a lot more steering angle as he goes through that turn on the final turn of the lap. So really interesting to see our tyre temperature sensors in full force, and also see the grip differences available after we've done our setup. So Chris, you just come back in from the initial run there. So how did you find it? How did it feel? Any feedback?
Initially, the car feels quite nice out of the box. It's quite balanced, but as the run progressed, it became very what I would describe as front limited, where you can really feel the front tyres, particularly the front left here, getting hotter and hotter throughout the run, and that's causing me to change how I'm driving the car. I'm struggling to get the car turned, I'm struggling to get the car stopped as well on the ABS, and that's really hindering my ability to get any lap time out of the car.
Well, we saw quite clearly on the VBOX that the outside edges on both front tyres was getting very, very hot quite quickly on the apex as well.
Yeah, you can really feel that when you're in the car. As you're trying to turn in, initially it's okay, but then as you get from mid to exit, where I really want to get on the throttle to drive the car out of the corner, that's where I'm finding the biggest limitation. I can't get to the throttle how I want to because the front's just pushing as I try to come off the corner.
So you get a massive mid-corner exit understeer basically. Just scrubbing the nose out.
Just trying to
holding
drive
off the power till it's back.
Either really delayed power application, or if I can drive through it, I'm just killing that front and then actually making the situation worse.
So that's exactly what we expect to see as well. So let's get the setup changes made, get our fast road geometry settings applied to the suspension, and then we'll get back out, do some more runs, and then overlay the data.
Super.
So as we've just seen on the data, we've just been out on track and we've been overheating the outside edges of the front tyres, and that's been leading to understeer. We've just taken the wheels off the car to start applying our setup and put our settings on there, and we've noticed straight away that on the front left tyre, this central block has worn on a massive camber angle. So these were brand new tyres this morning, and already this central block is almost dead. You can see from the angle of wear that it's actually been worn more like that. So as we lean the tyre over, this block is now flat, and that's because we've not got enough camber, so the tyre has physically been rolling onto the outside edge as we're going through the corner. This shows us visually, not just in the data, that we need to apply more negative camber. So as we're going through the corner, the tyre goes flat in the centre of the corner, using more of the width of the tyre, giving more traction, reduced understeer, and more even tyre wear. So the setup is not only going to make the car faster and more stable, we're also going to make our tyres last longer, which is going to heavily reduce costs for the track days. From Chris's feedback and the data, we can see that the front axle has nowhere near enough camber as standard. So we're going to get cracking on our setup. We're going to install our fast road suspension settings to the GT4 by making adjustments to the stock suspension components. That's going to include front camber being increased. We're going to go to max that we can on the stock adjustments. Rear camber increased. We're also going to be changing the rake angle on the car, lowering it on the ride heights, and also altering the anti-roll bar settings to give a more oversteer bias chassis to help reduce that understeer and help to fix some of the critical things that Chris pointed out how the car is driving. Our aim is to reduce that understeer bias as much as possible back towards a neutral bias with a slight tendency towards oversteer to make it much nicer to drive out on track. A really common question we get asked when we're doing this sort of setup on a Porsche GT car especially is, this is a Porsche GT car. It's one of the top end range models that Porsche make. So why isn't it as good as it could be out the factory? And why are we having to make these adjustments? And the answer is very simple. The adjustment is there to get these settings as standard. However, all of these cars have to pass certain regulations and have a certain amount of safety to be sold to the general public and around the world. It has to be set up for an understeer bias, so any level of driver can jump in this car around the world, and on the limit, the front end is going to wash out, which is the safest way for someone with little driver experience to experience a lack of grip. So that's the way they're set up. The second one is these cars have EU tyre wear regulations to worry about. They have to do snow test braking in Sweden on the ice lakes. So all of these different factors end up boiling down to a very generic setup. However, for us that are taking this car out on track, and for a lot of our customers around the world, we want the car to be as focused towards driving as fast as possible and having as much fun as possible in that chassis. And that's where this setup comes in.
To apply these setup changes, we're going to be using our MOTORSPORT flat patch. This is an exact flat patch that we have calibrated every time we come to circuit, so we can ensure that it's completely laser leveled and we're working on a perfect flat surface. This means that when we're using our digital camber gauge, we can apply exact settings, knowing that the numbers going on the car are exactly correct, and then it also means we have a perfect flat to work from when we're stringing that car up for our toe measurements to make sure there's no bump stick characteristics taking place, and all of our settings going on that car are exact, even though we're out on location trackside. So we've got the overlay here of the morning and the afternoon session. So on the left screen, we've got the morning session before the setup was applied. On the right screen, we've got the afternoon session after the setup was applied. You might notice on the track maps that they're a slightly different layout. This is because at Anglesey, it's very common to alter the layout before and after lunch. This isn't an issue though, because the VBOX software overlays the before and after laps identically, so we can show you corner by corner the exact overlay, even if the overall circuit isn't an exact likeness in terms of lap time. So we'll head off now into the data and see what we can see. So here we go straight into turn 1, and just after the apex here, I'm going to pause it. So as we can see straight away, turn 1, we're already overheating the outside edge on that front right tyre. It's loading it up, and due to the lack of camber, we're lifting that inside edge up off the floor, and we're massively overloading the outer edge here. So we can see it completely overheating the compound. Whereas after the setup, we're getting some nice heating through the tyre, but it's a much more even temperature distribution straight away through that corner. The other thing we can note quite clearly is that due to this scrubbing more understeering to the car due to the lack of grip, we're not really using these rear tyres. We're not loading the chassis enough because the nose is just washing, it's just driving through it. Whereas when we're now using the tyre compound much more effectively on the front, getting rid of that understeer, you can see that we're now actually starting to load the rear tyres and get right to the outside edge of the compound, whereas before we weren't getting anywhere near that. So we'll head off now, and down the straight you can see the front right tyre here before the setup isn't quite having time to cool down due to being overheated, and this takes an effect right here through the apex. So even though we're now through a right hand corner, the front left is being overheated like we'd expect with the lack of camber, again just shredding the outside edge. But what's more interesting is that the front right is also overheating even though it's not the loaded tyre in this scenario. And that's because it's not had time to cool down on the straight between turn 1 and turn 2 because we cooked it so hard through the left-hander. Whereas after the setup, we didn't overheat the compound and it's had that time to cool down, so it's still a nice working temperature, but it's not overheated. Front left, again, it was starting to get that outside edge and the temperature distribution is moving more inboard, but it's a much nicer distribution. Again, we're not quite on the inside edge still. This does indicate that we do need a little bit more camber in the setup, but we are at maximum in terms of what we can achieve as standard after the setup, so we're happy with the improvements so far. So now we're going to be heading in to quite a fast right-hander, and we'll take a little look at how the tyres operate through there. So again, it's turning that in quite at some pace, and again you can hear the understeer scrubbing in. And what's quite interesting, if you look inside the car now, we can see Chris's hands on the wheel. So he's actually dialing in a lot more lock before the setup was applied than he is after, and this is because through the fast right he's overcompensating with steering lock to fight the understeer to keep the car on the line we're looking for. Whereas after the setup he's actually got less lock dialed in, which means that he's got the car more under control, which through a fast corner like this is really quite important for the driver confidence. I'm going to go off now down to straight and again into a fast kink into a right. What's interesting here is looking at how the tyres have cooled after the setup compared to before. We're still carrying so much latent heat into the tyre as we go down that long straight section. Heavy braking zone there, just about to turn in, and what's really interesting is how those tyres have reacted under the heavy braking zone. So before the setup, we've got bright red overheating tyres. After the setup, we've got a really nice operating temperature under the heavy braking zone. Now, you'd think that after a setup which applies more camber to a tyre, that the inside edges under braking would be hotter after the setup was applied, whereas in fact, the setup with less camber has actually had a much worse tyre temperature effect under the heavy braking zone, and this is because of that latent heat we were talking about. It's carrying the temperature in the compound and it's not able to lose the heat because it's being overheated, so it doesn't have the time to cool down, which means that this temperature as the lap goes on builds and builds and builds in the compound, and it leads to these negative effects such as braking zones, where he's now going to have much more braking force going into this corner because he's not cooking that compound. Again, going through these corners, you can see how much the front tyres are overheating before the setup compared to after. And again, you can see here how we're actually using that rear tyre much better and getting right to the outside edge through the corners now. Whereas before, we're still a lot cooler than after the setup because we're pushing the understeer with these bright red blocks here as he's winding the lock on. So that's going to mean that we're pushing through the nose and not loading the tyres as we want to on both axles. We're approaching near the end now of the overlaid sectors, but again, we've got big red blocks through the front tyres as opposed to a much better even distribution. And again, this little inside patch here where it looks quite cool does tell me that we could do with having some more negative camber on the front axle still, because the way it's behaving, we've got a much better distribution and much less understeer, but there's definitely room for improvement there. And again, on this rear tyre, we're getting a much nicer heat spread now across that whole tyre, but we are just approaching into the red on the outside edge of the loaded tyres, whereas before it wasn't necessarily an issue, whereas now it looks like that's something we might need to start addressing as we build more grip into that chassis. So now we're going to come in here to the final corner of our overlaid differences, and again, massive difference in terms of latent heat through the tyre. So again, the unloaded tyre, front left through this corner, has carried so much more heat in the compound than it has after, which means in this side, after the setup, our temperatures are actually set up to go and tackle another lap, no problem whatsoever. Whereas in the before, these tyres are so cooked, and that actually leads on to the next point, which is why you might have noticed we've actually been overlaying lap 1 of one of our morning sessions versus lap 5 of one of our afternoon sessions. This is because after lap 1, with the car before we had any setup changes applied, after lap 1, all of our tyres were just constantly cooking. There was no time for cool down. They were completely cooked, all bright red, which we can show you a quick clip of in a second, and that's why we couldn't really use them for data overlay, because they were so far beyond cooked, it was an issue to actually see any usable data. Whereas after the set was applied, we were doing lap after lap, and the tyres were operating in a really nice window the whole time, showing us those distributions and giving us really key learning points from that compound, which is really good to see.
So we've finished going through the data there, and as we can see, at the beginning of the day, we had so much understeer and we were cooking the outside edges of those front tyres. After the changes were made with the full suspension setup, we can see that we've got much better tyre temp distribution and we've got a lot more grip coming from the car. Although we've made the car much better, we've got further to go. So now to bring the car back from that slight oversteer bias that the car is now generating, we need to get more rear camber onto the car, but that's not possible now without some hardware upgrades. We've maxed out the standard suspension to all of its maximums, and to get it any further, to push the car further along and make it even faster on track, we need to install some parts. First off, we're going to be installing our rear adjustable toe arms. This allows us to increase rear camber and still maintain the rear toe in. If we try and increase camber further on the rear of this car right now, we're not going to have toe in anymore, which is going to make the rear feel even looser, and it's not going to feel nice around the circuit. So that's our first upgrade. Next, we're going to be installing our top mounts, because although we've got the temperature distribution much better across the tyre after the setup, it can still be improved further, and that is with the top mounts increasing caster and camber, so we can use more of that tyre through the corner and increase grip overall for the whole chassis. So in the next episode, we're heading over to Oulton Park, again with Chris at the wheel. We're going to install these parts and we're going to overlay that difference.